So yeah, that's going to be a fun conversation.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Add
So
it to the list of fun conversations.
I know. Well, I mean, it might be a little sarcastic when I say FUD.
Yeah.
FUD.
all the topic of today. It's just so much
De- Dealers are not fond of FUD.
fun. Speaking of fun, man, I went to pick up dinner last night at the local butcher. So I got some steak tips, and they had hot dogs that looked fantastic. I was like, yeah, I'll get ahead of Memorial Day weekend here. So I got some hot dogs too. I walked in the house, and my wife just about smacked me. She's like, "What are you doing buying hot dogs? We're getting ready to go to like 3 different Memorial Day parties. It's gonna be nothing but hot dogs." Man, we're gonna go. We're ready.
I get hot dogs from my rancher. Oh my god, they're the best hot dogs ever.
You have a
So
rancher,
freaking good.
like a personal rancher?
It's someone I get all my beef and pork from. Local rancher.
Everybody should have a rancher.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't get meat from the grocery store.
we uh we actually buy half a cow at a time.
Yeah, I do that
We
too
put it in the
sometimes.
freezer. Yeah,
You must have a big freezer.
yeah, a couple of them.
Yeah, same here. Two huge stand-up freezers. Well, one's medium size, the other one's huge. And then two refrigerators, both having another freezer, side freezer.
You're spending $100 a month on electricity for your freezers, Jeff.
I try not to break it out. Probably close to it.
Be better for them to just give you the whole cow and you just let them graze and be your
Yeah,
lawnmower,
right.
like a one shop, one stop shop deal.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the beautiful part. We get ours from a neighbor, so we get to we know everything about that cow.
Well, yeah, same here.
As long as you don't know their name, I think it's okay.
Yeah, I don't know the name.
You usually don't name them in those cases. All right, 3 seconds here, guys. All right. Well, Tom, welcome back to Refresh Friday.
I'm glad to
Welcome,
be here.
Tom.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah.
You've been busy?
I have been busy. Yes,
I had a funny feeling you would say that.
yes, and the rest of June is busy as well.
We definitely appreciate you jumping on with us.
Oh, I'm always happy to.
You
No,
you racking
because
up
I
more
we
miles in June out of the
Yeah, I'll
airport?
be I'll be in Connecticut, Savannah, Georgia, Las Vegas, Harrisonburg, Virginia, and there's a couple other places too. I just can't remember off the top of my head. So yes,
I
I'm.
follow
Go
I
ahead.
follow you on Facebook, and so I see your posts and stuff. I was like, he must be busy, man. He's helping all these dealerships.
Yeah, I stay busy.
Non-stop fun talk, right?
That's it. That's it. That's why we're here today. Great segue, Alex.
Hmm.
You should be a podcast host.
Maybe one day. That's a
Okay.
life ambition. So, Tom, we wanted to have you on, I think, a week from now, which would have been even closer to go time with the FTC safeguards and the Gramm-Leach-Bliley. I always get I want to say
You got it right.
Leach-Bliley, but
It's
got
a
it.
horrible name.
Yeah. But the really fun stuff that's coming from the government on June 9th. So, because of your travel and whatnot, we had to bring you on a little earlier. So, the upside is anyone listening today or listening later is going to have a little bit more time to be that much more prepared.
Let's
So,
hope so.
Hard. that's the question. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being prepared, what would you say? I guess group all the dealership. How prepared are dealerships on a scale of 1 to 10, or even just the industry as a whole? Because a lot of it has to do with
Alex is saying
vendors.
a 3, and I'm going to have to agree with him.
Yeah.
I just was on the phone as an example with a dealer group, and we were talking about a lawsuit that he was involved with, and how we might be able to resolve that. And I said, by the way, how are you doing on your preparations for the Gramm-Leach-Bliley June 9th deadline? And he
He's
said,
like, what?
well, we're talking about that right now. So better
Yeah,
do a
probably
lot of
sounds about right.
better talk quickly.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of dealers who are just not preparing and or are not prepared. And there's a lot of vendors in the industry as well who are not prepared. So it's not dealers are having problems because the vendors aren't prepared. I had a conversation with a vendor this morning who was working on trying to actually two vendors who were trying to comply, and they were working on how they can assist the dealers, and they're having difficulty because, as you both know, a lot of the vendors also have vendors. And so, it's life in the food chain, and the vendors who are buying data from other vendors are having, some of the same issues. So it is a difficult issue. The way the regulations are written, it's hard for us in the car business to comply with them. And I'll just throw one example out is, the regulations say if you have a vendor who cannot comply, that you are supposed to find another vendor. Well, if you that's all fine and well if there is another vendor who can comply, number one. But think about the franchises. Think about if General Motors or if Subaru isn't complying, and because they're technically a vendor or service provider, all the RDRs and the information going back and forth when you're after you've sold a car and you're registering the car with the manufacturer. Well, that's supposed to be encrypted now, and if it's not, then you're supposed to get another vendor according to the FTC.
There's
Easy
lots of them
enough.
come out of China these days, right?
Right. So so there's a lot that is difficult for our dealers to comply with. So it's hard. Even if you're trying, it's hard.
It's in my role. I speak to a lot of vendors and partners and whatnot, and this isn't something that's had the attention that I think it deserves yet. To your point, Tom, it's like I don't know if people are. Let me take it back. I said 3 when that question. I held my 3 fingers up to maybe lead Tom a little bit, but the I said 3 because I think most people are aware at the very least. They're aware this is coming, and have some understanding of what it means in terms of maybe some advertising, maybe a little bit in terms of how data is getting passed. But they don't have a real true depth of understanding. And as you're just talking about now, as you start to peel back the layers, it becomes, wow, this is a much bigger beast than I think anyone truly realizes, including the government.
Right.
Probably.
Right.
So,
Yeah. I mean,
is this one of those things that's just going to get solved through lawsuits and fines?
well, I think, I have it from supposedly somebody who knows that the FTC has hired a lot of additional enforcement folks for this issue alone. So I've always said and will continue to say that if you're willfully non-compliant, in other words, you're not trying to do anything, you're not trying to comply, you don't have these policies written, you don't have You haven't designated a qualified individual who's in charge of the program. You don't have change management procedures. I mean, if you've just done some of the basics, but if you haven't done anything and you're willfully non-compliant, then I think you get barbecued. I think,
Okay.
the fines are $50,120 per violation. The definitions of violation have not been defined. So if you have a data leak, for example, and 100 names are leaked, that could be $5 million, or it could be 50,120, right? I think more like 5 million if you're willfully non-compliant, but if you're trying,
Yeah.
probably 50,120 is probably how that goes. And of course, the part of the difficulty with that is that in most instances, dealers don't have insurance to pay for the penalty. So they are self-insuring this issue. So right, so it's their money they're putting on the line for this issue, because if you don't have insurance to back it, then it's on you. So I feel like even though it's complicated, even though it's very difficult, even though it's hard to comply, even though we know that the industry standard for data is that ADF XML formatting, which is not encrypted, and all data is supposed to be encrypted both at rest and in transit, and our whole infrastructure is built on the ADF XML formatting. So it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to comply. But what have you done to try to comply is really what if the regulator comes in, and we don't know whether they're just going to come in and say, show me all your policies and your, or whether they're going to come in for some other reason. And while they're there, they're going to say, well, while we're here, we'd like to see your, how you're doing on these things. So hard to know how it's going to all roll out, but as one of your listeners just said, it's going to be a big barbecue. It could be a big barbecue.
Like a shock and awe out of the gate tactic.
Yeah. Scary.
Yeah. That's a really good point on the insurance side. Have you explored how the insurance companies are willing to insure this side of the business?
Yeah. So the only way that I know of, and Dante, we'll get to your question in just a second. I'm going to write that down. The only way I know of to insure this type of issue is what's called directors and officers insurance. So typically not purchased by car dealers. My clients, I all recommend, and anybody listening, I recommend that you look into it. The reason directors and officers insurance may come into play is the definition of what a claim is very broad. And as a result of it being so broad, it's, regulatory inquiry, it's administrative subpoenas typically are covered. And it's the only insurance policy that I'm aware of, and somebody I'm sure can correct me on this, that will actually insure for penalties. And it's a not often used tool by dealers because lots of dealerships are closely held, and most dealers own their own, and so they say, well, why would I need something like directors and officers insurance? And now I'm giving you a reason why, which is, to my knowledge, it's the only way of insuring fines from a governmental body.
Is this the kind of insurance that typically goes on like S and C corporations that have boards, for example?
Yeah. So if you're on a board, so let's say you're on the nonprofit board of your police department in your local town or your fire department, they typically will have D&O insurance to cover you as a board member so that you will serve, right? It's a way to protect you, to say, we really know that there's some risk in you being on our board. And if one of our constituents don't like what's going on, they're going to sue the board. And so that is the insurance that kicks in for when the board is sued. Dante asked about vendors being held to the same standard. Here's it. It really is going to depend, Dante, on what the agreement the dealer has with the vendor. Because if there's a data breach, and I'll use that as an example. If there's a data breach and the vendor is the one whose information was breached, or it was the result of the vendor not encrypting the data, then I think, yes, the vendor will be held liable depending on what the contractual relationship is between those two parties. From a business guy perspective, the dealer is going to ask the vendor to indemnify him against any claims. But then it's a question of, are you doing business with a deep pockets vendor who isn't going to go bankrupt as a result of, a data breach, right? Are you dealing with a huge vendor, or are you dealing with a smaller vendor? And if you're dealing with a smaller vendor, do they have cyber insurance that might kick in if there's a breach? So and I know I'm touching on a lot of topics here, but the dealership should have cyber insurance to protect themselves. And the vendor should have cyber insurance to protect themselves, but the vendor's also potentially on the hook for the dealer. And so that so the cyber insurance should be, you should contemplate cyber insurance as a part of the defense if you are one of those vendors providing data to the dealer.
Wow.
Like we said, fun stuff. Yeah.
Well, and I would guess, a lot of the vendors in the automotive arena are typically smaller vendors. Especially from a marketing standpoint with, the front end of sales. We're all signed up with, 20, 30 different vendors. They all do something special, something small. I can't imagine if they don't have insurance, or even if they do, it could put them out real quick.
Well, Jeff, it's even broader than that. And I'll give you an example of, I had a conversation with a dealer once who said, I want to change garbage vendors. And I said, why? And they said, because my buddy owns this garbage company and I want to use him instead. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, have him send me his insurance policies. I specifically want to see the pollution insurance. And he yelled and screamed and pounded. This, what are you, stupid? And do you not understand? This is how you're saying a garbage company doesn't have pollution insurance? That's just crazy. And he said, well, why do I care about that anyway? I said, well, let's start with the reason you care. The reason you care is because in pollution, so when you're hauling away waste oil, whatever the Freon equivalent is now, I can't remember the R something, when you're hauling away tires and waste, all the batteries that are used, the dealership and the dealer himself are held joint and severally liable for the disposal of that waste. So if your garbage vendor doesn't have the right pollution coverage, then the dealer himself is insuring that, whether he knows it or not.
Uh-huh.
So what did I find when I got the insurance?
You didn't have pollution insurance.
You didn't have pollution insurance, if you can imagine that. A garbage vendor didn't have pollution insurance. So
did he even know that was a thing?
I had explained it to him. It's definitely a thing. It's definitely a thing. Yeah. So Jeff, to your point, it's not just the data vendors that you need to check. It's all the vendors that you need to make sure that have insurance. And and I advocate a mechanism to track it. And it can be as simple as, an Excel spreadsheet, and you've got your payables clerk, which is the logical person to do this work, actually. Mm-hmm. The payables clerk and the dealership probably has 200 vendors. Is that fair? Something, maybe 250. Some of them, your office supply store, you need them to give you insurance.
I would say it depends on the price of the good. So if you're buying a $200 a month product, like tech product, for example, 200 dealerships, they're not going to have that kind of stuff. But
Sure. And some of them, I mean, Microsoft isn't going to give you their insurance information, right? And that's not important. But so you have to go through and obviously prioritize which ones that you think are important. But having your payables clerk track this kind of information is not a burden so much. I mean, when you start, it is, but you just start down the list alphabetically, and you say, look, we got 250. I want you to divide it by 12. I want you to do 20 a month, do one a day. And I'm going to come see you in 6 months and see how you're doing. And this should all be done within a year, right? Not unrealistic.
Fair. Yeah, that's fair.
You
That's
have to phase
actually-
these things in. You can't just say poof and all of a sudden.
it's a good practice. The bigger dealer groups always ask for our policy when we're prospecting or about to sign up one of their stores. So, and then they come back. Usually it's every other year. They come back and ask for the renewed policy.
Sure. And it doesn't cost you anything to give them a copy. There's no harm, no foul here. There's nothing insidious going on. It's just they want to make sure that you're covering yourself, and that in the event of a problem that you're going to cover them also.
Yeah, they're
We actually
looking
have
for a specific dollar threshold of coverage on
sorry.
specific things.
Say that again, Alex.
I said they're usually looking for a specific threshold of coverage on
Right.
certain items.
That's right.
And I'll throw this out just through the group here. If you're going to start doing this practice, I think you want to look for cyber insurance coverage from your vendor above $1 million. $2 million, I think, is where you start to look at, but it becomes difficult for some insurance companies to provide coverages above $5 million. So being aware that that the insurance companies might not go above a certain amount, period. Because I've heard, and it's been a while since we looked at this, because we obviously had to take ours to the max. But we couldn't go over a certain amount because of some sort of, might have been cyber crimes and the way they hold hostage. And like if you've got over a certain amount or something, I don't know. I'd have to check with our CFO again, but we went through all this a few years back, and it was
it's complicated. I mean,
weird stuff. Yeah.
When you think about from a dealership perspective, the numbers become staggering. So assume that average dealership, I would say conservatively, between the DMS, the CRM, they have 200,000 names. Is that fair? Okay. So that's my experience. Let's say the dealership has a breach, and let's say part of the remediation or what needs to happen after the breach is they pay for credit monitoring, right? So credit monitoring is $100 a year. So let's say they have to pay for credit monitoring. On 200,000 names, that's $20 million. Now, it's an opt-in thing. That's the way they usually do it to save money, is you have to opt in to get the credit monitoring, and the 200,000 names are obviously not going to opt in. So that's one way to ameliorate the risk for the dealer. But nonetheless, that kind of exposure is, tremendous. Yes, Justin Silver, thanks for chiming in here. There are software solutions. It's called GRC software, governance, risk, and compliance, and it does have a very simple, easy way to manage it. So I'm glad you brought that up. And that kind of software starts at roughly $500 a month that you can find that. So he is right. But lots of dealerships like using spreadsheets and Excel. It is, since he asked the question, GRC software is great because it acts as a hub, and many people can interact with that hub. So not so much necessary when you're dealing with vendor certificates, but there are other compliance items like
Okay.
the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, bringing it back to that, that multiple people have input, and so you can notate things in those kinds of software. So it is
Yeah, we keep track of all of it. Keep
correct,
track of communications and such.
correct.
Huh, interesting.
Yes, and there are also a number of software companies um, who specifically were built to handle, say, 40 to 50% of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. So there are solutions that help with that as well. And if anybody's interested, you can email me, and I'll be happy to connect you to those folks if that's of interest to you.
Perfect.
So
I'm
take a step
I'm
back. Sorry,
I'm
Joe.
curious real quick though. How many Tom Klines are out there helping dealerships in the industry as a whole?
Consultants.
Yeah, that has the expertise that you do.
Half a dozen,
Really?
two, three, four. I don't know. I mean, I don't know of
I'm
any.
thinking there's probably not a ton, and
I don't know of
it's
any. The answer to your question
So
is I don't know of any, but I'll give everybody the
really.
benefit of the doubt and say that there are other people that there are plenty of people who know the law, but might not
Mhm.
necessarily be consultants, right? I mean, I'm not the only one who's got the information. And
there's
the NADA has a good publication on the Gramm-Leach-Bliley. If you want to do it yourself, if you follow, I think there's 19 steps to it. If you want to
Mhm.
do it all manually, so I mean, there are good resources out there. But as far as people out there holding someone's hand to say, "Come on, we're going to walk through this together, and I'm going to be there every step of the way," I'm not aware of anyone, but I'm sure there are.
Okay. You got a
there
monopoly on it.
there are companies that are doing this on a more
Comply.
general scale.
Yeah.
Tom is
We
an ex
use
car
we use
dealer,
comply.
so he's very familiar with the realities of being a car dealer.
Mm-hmm.
um, whereas these other companies are more like, here's our checklist of things, and then come through and do it. And yeah,
Right.
they're out soliciting businesses now.
Right. There's a my family, Alex, as you know, because we were neighbors. My family's been in the car business since 1925, so we're coming up on 100 years here. Um, Something that no wonder why I feel old. Uh, but and the software solutions are not 100% solutions. As an example, I was on the phone with one of my clients yesterday who is changing his entire IT infrastructure as a result of the new regulations, and that
Wow.
you can't do that through software. That's just good old fashioned shoe leather, and you just got to make it. You got to do it, and you got to make it work. So if you're seeing advertisements that these software solutions are going to make you 100% compliant, I'd question that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's one thing to check off a box, but it's another thing when you've got a consultant explaining to you what the ramifications could be, how that will affect other things, what insurance, how much, insurance. There's so many nuances that go into it that obviously a sheet of paper or some software is not going to be able to fulfill for you.
Right. I mean, dealers are entrepreneurial, and they excel at risk. Right. They excel at saying, "I'm okay if that happens. That doesn't bother me. But if this happens, I really want to cover
Hmm.
myself. So how do I cover for that?" So, and that's a business decision, and that's what I do as a risk consultant. I say, "Look, here's what you're supposed to do. It's up to you if you want to do it. If you don't, here's what the risks are." And
Mhm.
and you can do a little, you can do a lot, we can do everything, we can do it all, we can do all, as a friend of mine says, we can do all of the things, and you can have as little risk as possible. um, but but there, every day that a dealer gets up and puts his feet on the floor, he's got risk, because and most of the risk comes from the moving mouths, right? He's got, I call it two-legged risk, which is customers and employees are walking around creating problems all day. That's where that's where the biggest risk is at a dealership. And secondary to that is, of course, all these regulations and rules that they have to comply with.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's more than what people realize. That's for sure.
So if we can take a step back, and I know we've covered this in the past, but I think it's worth revisiting. Are the areas that a dealer is going to be responsible for in these changes? So, for example, um, what parts of the website should they be looking at? Is there something about the CRM or the lead flow? What about paperwork around the dealership itself? Things like that. Do you mind listing off some of those items so that people who may be just getting into this are like, oh, that's another thing I need to be thinking about?
Sure. So let's start with um, the administrative safeguards. So you can't leave pay stubs laying around. You can't leave driver's licenses laying around. Any place that there is a data on your customers, if it's on paper, those doors should be locked.
Locked, yeah.
And I advance. This is something super simple, but door closers are important, right? There's $100 things that you stick, and there's a hinge on the door, and it makes sure the door shuts behind you. If you're in an F&I office, and if you have F&I offices at your store, and you don't have door closers that automatically lock the doors, do that today. That's an item you can get done today. Go to Home Depot, get the things, put it on, and check that box off. Because I don't start with this, but at dealerships, I could walk in and I can come in with boxes. I mean, I could just walk into the dealer's office and say, here's all the crap I found this morning before our meeting. And they get upset with that because then they got to figure out who gets what piece of paper and where I took it from. So, I mean, but it's easy to do. It's easy to find that information. So the physical safeguards, making sure that whatever information you have on paper and or on a computer are safeguarded. So on the computer side, making sure that the computers automatically log off X minutes after somebody leaves, especially on the showroom floor, right? Where they're logged into the CRM and those kinds of things. So from a kind of, I'm going to walk through the showroom here and then kind of pull out a little bit to some of the questions you asked. You're required to have multi-factor authentication, which is called MFA. And multi-factor authentication is that annoying thing where you get a text message or an email and you have to authenticate that you are you before you can log into the computer. A good tool for that is Cisco, the big computer company, Cisco. The product is called Duo, D-U-O, and it's like $3.50 per month per user, and it's the easiest to implement. Simple to do, and I suggest you get that on all your computers because that's a part of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. So physical, technical, and administrative safeguards is what you're required to do. So going over to the website, any forms that transmit personally identifiable information, and personally identifiable information also known as PII, any forms that get submitted through your website to your CRM or to anywhere else that you might route them are supposed to be encrypted. So the definition of PII has changed. It used to be date of birth, social security number was PII. And they've changed the definition. So now your home address is included, your cell phone number is included, and your email address is included. So when the data is transmitted between, let's say somebody says they want to schedule a test drive, Tom Kline, my email address is tomk@BetterVantagePoint, and my phone number is, and I send the form in.
Do we have to encrypt this now, Tom?
You have to encrypt it now. Oh yeah, you have to encrypt it. Yeah, that's right. That's all on my website, so that's all public information.
Okay. Go ahead.
Anybody who wants to call me, they call me. They call me all day and all night, so don't worry about that. Here it is. So that has to be encrypted, and it's not being encrypted because for those who know about the ADF XML format, it's a non-encrypted format, and most of as we talked about a few minutes ago, most of the car business runs on that format. So that is a violation. That is a problem. Now I've figured out only one way to get around that at the moment. And there are companies that will use you could put a QR code on your website, and there are companies that will encrypt a session. So you zap the QR code with your phone, then all of a sudden you're in an encrypted session, and you can do it that way. Now that's very awkward.
Yeah.
It's not efficient, and it's not great, but is the only way that I have found so far that you can actually encrypt those forms on your website. So, for example, on your service scheduler, and a lot of those are iframed in to the websites. For those of you who don't know what an iframe is, when you're looking, if you look at the URL up at the top of the screen and it says abcmotors.com/schedule your service, when you're looking at that, it's not actually on your website. It's visually framed to look like it's your website, but it's really your service provider's form. And so when you're doing that, you don't know if that's encrypted or not. You're required to call all these vendors. Actually, you're required to write these vendors and get in writing whether they're encrypting their data at rest and in transit. So customer data platforms are a potential solution, a partial solution here. And there's been a lot of talk about customer data platforms this year more than ever, or the last 12 months. I know a lot of the conferences have been talking about that. Some of them have some of it that will help this problem, but it's not going to fix the problem.
CDPs, the new digital retailing.
Right.
Yeah. Most of your car dealership credit apps, a lot of times, are, a framed in piece. In the past, I don't know how popular it still is, but there used to be a service that offered high encryption. Well, this was years ago, so I'm not sure how encrypted it was. Just for the credit applications on dealership websites. Because you've got a lot of the OEM, or I should say, a lot of the website vendors. They have their own online credit application piece. And what I've seen most of the time, they're pretty secure. You got to log into a separate screen in order to pull that information. They only send over the most generic information into the CRM. But I'm certain. What was the name of that company, Alex? Do you remember?
I know there was one. I remember, Jeff. I just don't remember the name of it either.
I remember the Talking Lady credit app, but
yes, that's the one I'm talking about.
Is that the one Meta was selling?
Yeah, we did use that at Mile One. It was funny because you switch over to Spanish, and the way the woman was dressed changed quite significantly.
Well,
anyways, I don't know where I was going with that.
The point here is, and Tom mentioned this a moment ago, and I think this answers Dante's second question here. It's the PII, the important information we need to be careful with, has expanded beyond just the Social Security number and date of birth. It's gone on to be pretty much everything except the first name and last name.
Right. So Dante's question is, some of the information is already publicly available. And so what does that really mean? Well, the answer, Dante, is you're right. And for those of us, and I don't know you, but for those of us on the screen, I think the three of us all remember that thing that we call the phone book, right? And if you go back to Steve Martin, when he looks up and he goes, "I'm in the phone book. I'm in the phone," right? so
that's Noel when you're dating yourself again.
Yeah, I'm a little, 30 years in the car business,
Some people are like, "Who's Steve Martin?"
Who's Steve Martin?
The new regulations say that is part of what you're supposed to protect. Obviously, a lot of that information is in the public domain. It used to be in the phone book. So you can Google, I haven't done it, but I'm sure you could Google my name and figure out where I live, like in 5 seconds or less.
Yeah.
That doesn't have anything to do with the regulations. The regulations still say you have to protect that. Now, if I were a dealer and the FTC came in and said, you're not doing this, I would try as a defense to say, well, look, a lot of this information is available, just go look. I don't think that's going to go very far. I think it goes back to the willful noncompliance in the barbecue question.
Mm-hmm.
But you can try. So I think that answers your question. And I was talking, so I didn't see, I think, the next question from Clint.
Actually, Clint has a number of questions he posted in the Dealer Refresh forums, and I did want to get to those,
Sure.
especially since he showed up. He said he wasn't going to be here today, so
Hi, Clint. Welcome.
yep. Thanks for throwing all these together, Clint. So his questions are very specific and detailed, and I think that they're very relevant to all. If you can just
Sure.
change out like Nebraska, where Clint is, for example. But the first one, he asks, each state likely has their own data retention minimum requirements. In Nebraska, it is clearly stated to be 5 years. He's heard that there are maximum retention timelines as well, but not sure what they are. Can I retain customer information in my CRM as long as we have periodic contact with this person on an ongoing basis? So,
Okay. So, Clint, you are required to have a data retention policy as a part of the safeguards rule. And the data retention policy, I have not heard, there are no maximums. Like you're only allowed to keep it up to 12 years or 10 years or whatever. So it's up to you, but you have to have a legitimate business reason why you're keeping the data, because they look at the data. And as a colleague of mine says, it's like toxic waste. If it's just sitting there, it's really a liability of the dealership if you're not doing anything with it. So the data retention policy should say, after no contact for X years, we get rid of the data. And you have to have a written policy for that data retention. And then you have to, from an operational perspective, somebody actually has to do that. They have to go into the CRM and figure out how you purge the data. They have to go to your DMS provider and say, look, if they haven't come in the service department in 5 years, purge the data. We don't need it. And so wherever the data is sitting at your dealership, you have to have a policy. You have to have a way to follow up on that. And you have to have a business reason and articulate what that business reason in your data retention policy to say, we want to keep this data because we reach out to our customers by telephone every 6 months. And if they tell us to screw off, then we take them out. And otherwise we keep following up because we like to wish them happy birthday, whatever the situation is and however your policies work. So I am not aware of any maximums. And you have to consider the minimums, like car deals now. People are financing for 84 months. So it's completely reasonable to say, I got to keep it at least for 7 years, if not for 9 years, because they might call afterwards with a question about, for example, if you have digital retailing tool and you scan everything and all the paperwork is up in the cloud, you certainly don't want to purge that. There's also, not to overcomplicate this, but there's also IRS requirements on each of these items. So check with your CPA on what those IRS regulations are, because you have to balance your data retention rule with what the IRS says you have to keep to make sure that you're not getting rid of stuff that you are going to have.
yeah. The
I didn't even think
IRS can
about
go
that.
back 15 years, can't they?
They can.
I don't think there's a real statute of limitations, but
remember, I'm a business guy, not a lawyer and not a CPA. But so that's my disclaimer. But if my understanding is if you are defrauding the government, they can go back as many years as they want. Outside of that, I think it's 7. Not 100% sure.
7.
Talk to your CPA.
7 or 8. Yeah.
you're supposed. I know my CPA always tells me, hold on to the last 7 years of receipts and everything that we
Hmm.
filed. But
Right.
you're right, fraud for sure.
Right.
But I had heard 15 in other instances. So anyway, I am neither a CPA or an attorney myself. So
Me neither.
Clint's next question, he had four. So the second one is a good one about ADF XML emails. We touched on some of this already, so I'll skip past a portion of it here and get to at what point is data transmitted into my CRM through unsecured methods? Is that data considered my data? Is it my data when it hits my email or when the customer clicks submit on my website or on a third party listing site, for example?
It's even more basic than that. The FTC says you're responsible for all your vendors. As a dealership, you're responsible. So if your vendors aren't encrypting it, that's your problem. The FTC says, just as we talked about with changing OEMs earlier, if your vendors aren't encrypting the data, then you should change. Obviously, you're not going to do that with the OEMs. There may be a situation like the CRMs. I'm not aware of any CRMs that are encrypting data. Somebody can reach out to me and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm happy to be wrong. But if the regulations say that if you don't have one, you need to go find one and make the change. Well, if there are none who are complying, then if you can document that and say, look, we called 5, here's our documentation where we called them. Excuse me. And every 6 months we have it to call them. And here's the last year's worth of data. Nobody is doing this. We have nobody to switch to. I think you have a good story to tell. I'm not telling you the FTC isn't going to fine you. I don't know what happens in that situation where there are no vendors who are doing it properly. But again, you're talking about attempting to be compliant versus willfully non-compliant.
Hmm.
I think you end up in a better situation. But the regulations say you are supposed to change vendors. So it goes back to, it's all on you because dealers are considered a financial institution, and that's why the regulations are written that way.
Oh, I'm hearing two themes for today. We probably want to repeat them at the end again, but the first one is be aware and have things written down that show that you're trying to be compliant with the laws and the rules and the acts and all that fun
I
stuff.
guess that's where that software piece would come in pretty handy.
Sure, but it doesn't have to, Jeff. I mean, if you're going to do it by binder, 3-ring binder,
Hmm.
it's fine. I would recommend you put to anybody who wants this. I'm glad to send it to them. I came up with a form called a report of discussion form, and it basically has the date and the name, person you talked to, the time you talked to them, what the topic was, and what was discussed, and any follow up. It's that simple. You can make one in 5 minutes. Um, just write out the report of discussion. Talk to Susie Q. Susie said they're working on it. They should be encrypted in 3 months, and they're in beta testing now. And call back in 4 months. And so you make a note, and then you stick a note on your Outlook calendar.
Hmm.
Say call back and find out if they're encrypted yet. And when you do that, you make another note, and you just stick it in the binder. If there's more elegant ways to do it, Jeff, but
Yeah.
good old fashioned manual way works too.
Paper pen, baby.
Right. So that's the other one. Documenting.
Yeah, because that shows. I mean, the car business is a business, and has been and always will be. If it's not signed and documented and on paper, it never happened. Whatever it was, it just never happened. And so this is being in compliance with these laws and rules is no different. You have to document it and show somebody that you're trying.
So Clint's third question, I think we've already hit it. He was
Yeah.
saying, what's reasonable in a lot of these cases, and I think you're touching on it. We don't know yet,
Hmm.
but as long as you are able to prove that you're trying to be compliant, chances are you'll fare better.
Yeah.
Correct.
So the fourth question, apologies, I didn't read this one in advance. So the ADF XML data referenced above is very basic customer information. name, phone, email, and what vehicle they're looking at. There is not credit information contained in these emails. I realize that the safeguard rules do not differentiate. I just wanted to be clear what the information is. So,
Yeah, the PII, the definition of PII is name, address, phone number, and email. So those are the items you have to protect.
everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
Even if you're in the phone book.
Which doesn't sound reasonable to me, but we'll have to see how this shakes out.
It doesn't sound reasonable to me either, but that's what the regulations say. So I had one dealer tell me last year, he said, I'm just going to wait until the NADA gets this law booted, and then I'll have to worry about it then.
Yeah.
Said, okay.
That's risk assessment.
That's it. He did his risk assessment. And that was it. I've done my risk assessment. I'm just going to wait and see what happens. Okay.
That'd be a fun one to say to the FTC people who walk into the dealership. I'm waiting for your shit to get canceled.
That's it.
Okay. Well, yeah, you're welcome, Clint. Thanks for putting those questions together in advance.
Yeah, that was great.
Yep. And safe travels. So all this goes into effect on June 9th. And again, we don't know what repercussions, what's going to happen. Are people going to walk into dealerships and just start assessing things immediately? One thing we need to keep in mind overall, people, is that this is nationwide. It's not targeted at a specific industry. And
Correct.
True. I forget about that.
Correct.
And Tom, do you what do you think, in your opinion?
Yes, I'm both. I went to school a long time, Clint.
Clint's
I'm just a car dealer guy. That's all I am. I was a car dealer for 30 years. That's what I got.
So, in your opinion, when they go after people or companies or whatever it is, do you think it's going to be the biggest fish they can find, the most non-compliant, to scare everyone?
So, if you look at history, recent history, the state, this is a federal regulation, but I'm going to bring the state in here just for a second. So the state attorneys general have become very politically motivated. And of course, it's easy to pick on a car dealer. Some of them who've been fined recently may deserve it. They may not. I can only tell you what the press releases say and read between the lines on what the press releases say. The FTC in the past year, to just take a couple of examples, Passport Automotive in the Mid-Atlantic was fined $3.38 million. Napleton Automotive was fined last May, I think it was, $10 million, right? And if you read the press releases from the Federal Trade Commission on those two, the reason those got started was from customer complaints. So customers, and when you read through the press release, for example, in the Napleton one, and I haven't read it in quite a while, but then one consumer complained that he couldn't get his down payment back. It was $4,000 or something, and he says he complained to the dealership, and everybody ignored him. So from a risk perspective, from where I see, for example, I was in a 6 rooftop group that didn't have anybody designated at any of the 6 stores to handle customer complaints. If you're not handling customer complaints, that's typically how regulatory problems start, in my opinion. They don't just randomly, I don't know, maybe they will, but to my knowledge, they don't just randomly walk into dealerships and say, let me see your stuff. I think they go to
be initiated.
I think they go in their database and say, okay, who are we getting the most complaints on? Which dealerships are we getting the most? Let's start there, because where there's smoke, there's fire. And so if you're not handling your customer complaints, you're causing yourself a problem. You're shooting yourself in the foot. Solve the customer complaints. The biggest thing I hear is, and I just was on the phone with another dealer in this issue who had a big problem. And he said, we didn't do anything wrong. And I said, I understand this isn't going away until you make it go away. So you can write a smaller check for it now, or you can let it blow up and write a bigger check later. However you want to do it. And in this case, I mean, and I was completely serious. I mean, these problems just don't go away. Customer problems don't go away. So if you're not going to fix them, then you can expect eventually you'll expect a visit from a regulator.
At some point.
And so if you don't have good customer processes, I'd say as a part of your what I call governance, risk, and compliance program at the store, is you should put into place who's responsible to handle the customer problems, how those policies should flow, how much money they can spend before they have to check with someone. Fix every problem that is less than $1,000. Don't even tell me about it. You're still accountable to me for it, but you don't have to check with me every time you spend, $1,000. At the end of the month, we're going to pull the account, and you and I are going to go through them, and I'm going to see how you're giving away my money. All valid concerns, but at the same time, and I'm not saying you have to give away the store either. I mean, just because they want $5,000 or something doesn't mean you have to give them $5,000. But somebody has to work with them and maybe get them down to $2,000 or $1,000 or a $5,000 credit to your service department, which isn't the same as $5,000, right? There's a lot of different ways to do that, but somebody has to fix the problems, or they're going to go to the regulators, and then you're going to have a different problem.
I would definitely think that's an important position, especially right now. For whatever reason, I just am seeing, and not just here at this dealership, because we haven't made any changes, but just across the board. And we should probably have someone maybe from DealerRater on to maybe support this. But since COVID, it seems to me like people bitch a lot more.
I don't know. It's easy, Jeff, to be a keyboard warrior, and so
Yeah.
so what my feeling on that is, if you're a dealer, first of all, somebody should go on to the major websites every day: Google, Yelp, Yahoo, Facebook, DealerRater. Then there are a few other ones.
Mm-hmm.
And they should post a response. Thank you for your response. I'm going to call you today, and whatever their name is. Then you pick up the phone and you call the customer, because you can figure, even if they don't use their name, everybody knows who it is. All you have to do is say, this is not hard stuff. Pick up the phone, get the customer in, solve the problem. Just solve it, fix it. And then once you've done that, and this helps sell cars, by the way, once you've done that, you ask the customer to, and if you've heard me say this before on a previous one of these, you ask them to update their review. You don't ask them to change it, because if you ask them to change it, they get upset and feel manipulated. That's not the reason you're doing it. You're trying to get them to update it, because anybody else who reads those reviews, and I'm sure anybody from DealerRater would agree with me on this. If you're shopping for a car and you go onto a dealer's reviews and you say that there's, nobody expects perfection, but if you see a dealer got trashed, and they said, and I see this all the time, the dealers say, "Thank you for your comments. We appreciate your patronage, ABC Motors. If there's anything we can do for you, please let us know." And the customer has already told you what they can do, what you can do for them. They just listed it. I mean, and you're asking them to do it again. They already told you once. Just read. Yeah. And so,
That's
you sound tone deaf. And so, as a result, anybody who's shopping for a car looks at it and says, "Well, these people are asleep at the switch. I don't want to go there." Mm-hmm. And so, my belief is, if you handle reviews properly, number one, it will help you sell more cars, because the public actually sees that you do care. And a lot of customers who I helped personally when I was doing this myself, because I did all this myself, I checked the websites first thing in the morning, and I posted reviews. And when I got to the office, I called them and said, "Come on in." And, that was part of what I did. There were customers who bought 5 and 6 cars from me over 30 years because I fixed their problem. So they knew if they had a problem, they were going to come back and see me, and I was going to fix it again.
Yeah, and there's we've got some vendors in the we've got some vendors that actually do a really good job at taking care of reputation management for dealerships. We use Wide Whale, and we get a bad review, we'll go ahead and get that alert first thing in the morning or via text, and they'll work with us to come up with a response. But I've only said within those reviews, there's nuggets of gold all through. And if you just take the
Absolutely.
time to read the review and be able to respond, you know, it's huge. And before you know it, you know, even with your individual salespeople, especially with DealerRater, customers will come in and ask for you specifically just because.
Well, if dealers use those reviews to make operational changes, it's super
Hmm.
important because they'll tell you how to run your business better if you just listen. Now, I'm not telling you every one of them knows what they're talking about, but there's some good feedback there, especially if you've got a rogue salesman and you keep getting complaints. After the third complaint, that guy should be in your office. I mean, it's probably after the first one, but definitely after the third one.
Sure.
Right. I mean, where there's smoke, there's fire. So
Yeah.
important to use those reviews for operational reasons too.
You also, if you can get the customer to update their review, now you've got a written document of how you have helped customers in the past. And if that customer ever comes back with something else, like, well, hey, here's your
Well,
words right here.
well, the FTC. I'm glad you said that because I failed to say this earlier, Alex. You're required to keep a copy of your customer complaints and how you've resolved them. That's
Yeah.
part of the compliance management system that you're supposed to have at the dealership. So you are supposed to be documenting
Hmm.
all of your complaints so that if they come in, they can say, "I want to see all your complaints and I want to see how you resolve them."
That's not happening.
And that's not happening. If a vendor, if I missed Dante's question,
Here.
if a vendor is sharing dealer data with another vendor to become the responsibility of the sharing vendor to confirm all tertiary vendors are in compliance, the dealer is only responsible for their vendor. If the vendor wants to then talk to the other, that's their problem, not yours.
Okay. It's a good question now.
Mhm.
Yeah, it is good. I mean, now from a that's from a Gramm-Leach-Bliley perspective. From a risk perspective, as far out as you want to go to try to make sure that there's plenty of buckets of money if something happens that you can go after, that's always an option, right? Those are two separate answers. From a GLBA, you're only required to manage your vendor. What your vendor does with their vendor is their business. From a
Mhm.
risk question, if you want to find out that your vendor has another vendor and ask for their insurance certificate or however you want to do that, that would help essentially boost um, the potential monetary the pool of money that you could go after if you have a data breach or something like that
Right.
happens.
So, for example, you find out your website vendor is doing their secured stuff through a third party,
Correct.
then you'd want to. Okay.
You could, right? I mean, but again, that's a business decision, a risk question. Do I want to spend the time and energy going through all that? Maybe
And
yes.
how do you know to find those things too? That's
You have to ask. Somebody has to say,
yeah.
"Okay, Mr. Website Vendor, is this all homegrown, or do you have other pieces that you parse out to other vendors?"
Yeah.
Fun stuff, right, Alex?
That's fun stuff. Yeah. So again, as we're past our allocated time today, and I think that's a good thing. There's a lot in here, and it's very complex, and we don't know where this is going to go. Um, it's June 9th. This thing rolls out. Don't expect a mob of government agents to walk into your dealership and hunt through everything. This is probably going to be, as Tom said, the the most obvious offenders, which in his opinion sounds like it's probably people with a lot of customer complaints potentially. Um, would be the ones that they would look at first, because where there's smoke, there's fire. And
Mm-hmm.
if you are handling your customer complaints and then you are documenting very well, things that you've done to fix those customer complaints, and then other things that you're doing to talk to your vendors to find out about how they're handling this change in security, change in privacy, all this fun stuff. Um, Chances are you'll fare better.
I
No
agree.
doubt.
And the regulators that I talk to would agree with you too.
Good.
Tom, if people want to reach out to you, what's the best way?
You can I have no PII. It's all on the web. You can fill out a form at bettervantagepoint.com. You can email me at tomk@bettervantagepoint.com, and or my cell phone is 757-434-7656.
Awesome.
All
You know,
right.
in my, if I can leave with one parting
Do you
comment,
really need any more phone calls? I have, I have a feeling you've got a shit ton of clients
I have,
lined up.
as they say in the South, I have a gracious plenty.
Nice.
So I understand, and I know that running a dealership is like trying to tuck an octopus into bed, and the tentacles keep flopping out. So
I've never heard that analogy before, but I like it.
that's because I made it up.
It's a good one.
So, so keep working on keeping those tentacles tucked in, and if I can help, I'm glad to. Feel free to reach out.
Awesome.
And thank you for all the help you've given me, Tom, over the years. And
Absolutely.
yep,
Glad to help.
appreciate
All
it.
right.
And I will.
Well, we'll
I'll
have to check
absolutely
back.
recommend Tom as a help to you. So
Yeah, we'll have to check back in here maybe 6 months to a year and see what juicy stories you have.
Stay tuned.
All right.
all right.
All right, guys.
Enjoy your
Take
Memorial
care.
Day weekend, everybody.
Yes.
Thank you.